Okay, so let's get this started. Welcome back, everyone. It's been a while, but I'm glad to see you all again. Um, Last time we met, we looked at Rabbi Meir, and during our talk about him, I mentioned that really it's difficult to understand the full context of Rabbi Meir's life without also paying some attention to two key figures that played an important role for Rabbi Meir. One of whom was Beruria, his wife, and we're going to get to her next time. But the one we're going to be focusing on today is we're going to be going back in time a little bit and looking at Elisha ben Abuya, otherwise known as Acher, who is a third generation Tana, about the same generation as Rabbi Akiva. And he, along with Rabbi Akiva, was Rabbi Meir's other notable teacher. Um, Rabbi Meir is usually assigned to Rabbi Akiva, however, as his disciple, in the sort of genealogies of master and disciple in the rabbinic tradition. Um, because the most significant thing about Elisha ben Abuya from the standpoint of the rabbinic tradition is that he was an apostate. Um, what that means essentially is that he was a rabbi. He belonged to the rabbinic community, but at some point later on, he rejected Judaism entirely and left the rabbinic fold and went out and sort of tried to live life outside of the Jewish community. So this is the most important thing about Elisha ben Abuya as far as the rabbis are concerned. Um, the sages seem to have regarded him with a kind of fascinated horror because of what he represents. The idea that a rabbi, learned in the Torah, a respected member of the rabbinic community, could somehow come to reject Judaism entirely, right? That idea, that image, I think really disturbed the rabbis. And so as a result, there are many stories in the rabbinic literature about Acher, particularly in the Talmud. Both the Babylonian Talmud, which is the more commonly referenced Talmud, and of course the Talmud Yerushalmi, which has its own collection of stories about Acher, that some of which are a little different from the ones found in the Babylonian Talmud. So the rabbis loved to talk about Elisha ben Abuya, I think because he was a source of some degree of anxiety and concern for them. Not just in terms of who he was and what he did, but also I think what he represented for them. So let's start with we've done some origin stories so far. With many of these rabbis. With Elisha ben Abuya, the origin stories that are going to interest us are the stories about how he became an apostate, how he came eventually to reject Judaism. There are several different stories that, many different stories actually, circulating in the rabbinic literature about Elisha ben Abuya and how he came to reject Judaism. They generally tend to fall into a few general categories. So in some versions of the story, Elisha is witness to some event in which some terrible fate befalls a person engaged in performing a mitzvah, in doing some act of Jewish piety. And witnessing this causes him to question the goodness or even the existence of God. So one example, the story goes that one day Elisha saw a man climb to the top of a palm tree and take the baby birds out of the nest without sending the mother away. This is a commandment specifically enumerated in the Torah that when you come upon a nest with baby birds in the nest, you're allowed to take the baby birds, but you first need to send the mother away. He sees this man go up the tree, take the baby birds without sending the mother away, and climb back down the tree and go on his way. The next day, he saw a man climb the tree and send away the mother. But when that man climbed down, a snake bit him and he died. And Elisha is reported to have said, Scripture says, send away the mother, that it will be well with you, and you may prolong your days. Where is the good in what happened to this man? Where is his length of days? So in that version of the story, and in a number of somewhat similar stories that are related, what really sends Elisha out of Judaism is some sort of experience that he sees that causes him to question the rabbinic belief in divine reward and punishment, and that's ultimately what sends him away. Other tales attribute Elisha's apostasy to something going wrong in mystical practice. So Elisha ben Abuya is one of the 4 key rabbis who are said to have entered the orchard. In other words, who are said to have engaged in spiritual practice that was supposed to result in mystical visions. So of these 4, only Rabbi Akiva is said to have entered in peace and come back in peace. Concerning Elisha ben Abuya, what it says is that he uprooted the shoots. In other words, whatever he saw in his mystical visions caused him to question the basis of his Jewish faith. Now, once again, there's a couple of different stories that circle around about what it is that he might have seen and how that was that he came to, like, what it was about his Jewish faith that was shaken by that experience. One version of the story has it that he goes up to heaven and sees the angel Metatron, and the angel Metatron is sitting in order to write down all the good deeds of Israel. But Elisha sees an angel sitting and is shocked because he assumes that means that this angel is on an equal level with God and begins to question whether there is only one God. And as a result of that, his faith is shaken and he's and he finds his way out of Judaism. So that's take 2, is that Elisha's exit from Judaism has something to do with mystical experience and the fact that he was engaging in mysticism in a way that ultimately took him further away from Judaism rather than bringing him closer in, as it was the case with Rabbi Akiva. The third account is actually Elisha's own account, and it's somewhat different from the other 2. So he once told his pupil, Rabbi Meir, a story related to his birth. So in this story, for his circumcision, his father Abuya threw a big party and invited all the prominent citizens of Jerusalem to attend. During the festivities, Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer sat apart in a different room and they were studying Torah. And their study was so intense that a fire came down from heaven and surrounded them both. This is something that sometimes happens in rabbinic stories. It seems to be something that occurs when Torah study gets very, very intense. So impressed by this miraculous display, Abuya decided to dedicate his son Elisha to Torah study. He said, my son is going to study, if this is the power of Torah, then my son is going to be devoted to Torah. But because his intentions in devoting his son to Torah study were not pure, were not for the sake of heaven, those intentions concerning his son were not fated to endure. That's the story that Elisha ben Abuya tells. So if we can take this story seriously, then what it indicates for Elisha ben Abuya is perhaps a kind of fatalism concerning his own situation, that in some sense, the root of things that, of the circumstances that, were involved in his getting involved in Torah study in the first place were tainted in such a way that he was basically doomed from the start. And this fatalism is kind of characteristic of Elisha as we see him in a number of stories in which he interacts with Rabbi Meir, his students. There are many occasions when Rabbi Meir tried to get him to repent and come back to Judaism. And Elisha declared that he had heard a voice from heaven calling, "Return, O you backsliding children, except for Acher, except for him, Elisha ben Abuya. In other words, repentance may have efficacy for everybody who sins, except for Elisha ben Abuya. That's how he saw it, at any rate. And so, if that story is in any way reflective of the man himself, then it reflects a certain kind of fatalism, a certain kind of attitude, that maybe he saw himself as unable to return, even if there was some part of him that wanted to. So, whatever the reasons for his leaving Judaism, it's clear that from the rabbinic stories that get told about him that he does leave Judaism. The question then becomes, what is the nature of his apostasy? Like, what does it mean that Elisha ben Abuya left Judaism? And there again, things are maybe a little bit unclear. And I think that the reason for that is possibly because the rabbis themselves, who, remember, are the ones telling these stories, right? These are rabbinic stories told about Elisha ben Abuya. The rabbis themselves may not have been very well informed about what life was like outside of Judaism, right? They were themselves very heavily involved in the rabbinic community. They weren't necessarily too well informed about what life was like outside of that community. And so their depictions about what exactly Elisha ben Abuya was getting up to outside of Judaism were then perhaps necessarily a little bit sketchy. Some accounts seem to depict him as being a devotee of Greek philosophy. In other words, he rejected Judaism and he started reading a bunch of Greek books. He became wrapped up in Greek philosophy and was heavily involved in what we would in what was basically the equivalent at the time of a secular education. So he rejected rabbinic and religious studies for a different kind of study, for Greek philosophy and the natural sciences. Some stories seem to depict him as engaging in some kind of idol worship or belief in more than one god, right? This is maybe connected with some of the stories that depict him as being the sort of victim of a bad mystical experience, right? Where he comes to assume that maybe there's two powers. And so, based on the hints there, we can maybe formulate the hypothesis that he might have become wrapped up in some sort of Gnostic kind of religion, right? The kind of belief that there's actually two different deities. There's a spiritual deity and a physical deity, and the deity of the physical world is evil. That Gnosticism was an important religious stream in the Hellenistic world, at the time. And so there's a possibility that Elisha ben Abuya may have become embroiled in that sort of thing, and that's what took him out of the rabbinic community. One account, which is really interesting, depicts him as someone it says he would show up at the Beit Midrash, at the house of study, and he would try to get the students who are there studying Torah to give up their Torah study for more practical occupations. It says he would say to this one, you should be a builder, and to that one he would say you should be a carpenter, and so on and so forth. That it depicts him essentially as rejecting religion altogether and trying to uproot the shoots, right? In other words, the newly growing Torah scholars, by trying to persuade them to abandon Torah study in favor of focusing more on this world and things that would be more economically beneficial to them, right? So that's one version of the story that gets told about who he is and what he's doing. In any event, in many of the stories, what is very, very clear is that part and parcel of his apostasy is his rejection of Jewish law and particularly of rabbinic practice. So there's a number of stories that very specifically depict him as riding a horse on Shabbat, right? So riding a horse on Shabbat was a violation of the laws of resting on Shabbat, according to the rabbis. That's why Jews didn't travel, during Shabbat. People stayed at home and walked to the synagogue or walked to the house of study, right? So depicting him riding a horse on Shabbat, or in one notable story, riding a horse on Yom Kippur that happened to also fall on Shabbat, right? That's a way of depicting him in sort of an almost hyperbolic way as sort of very explicitly rejecting everything to do with his former life and with the values of the rabbinic community that he came from, right? Interestingly enough, right, there's another take on the whole Elisha ben Abuya story and the character that is a lot more modern, because Elisha ben Abuya is the main character in Milton Steinberg's novel, As a Driven Leaf. So Steinberg has his own particular take on Elisha ben Abuya that is certainly based off of the depictions that we see in rabbinic texts, but also has its own particular kind of flavor to it, um, kind of mediated through a modern conception of like the struggles that are faced by assimilated Jews in the 20th century, right? So Milton Steinberg's version of Elisha ben Abuya depicts him kind of as the prototype of the modern assimilated scholarly secular Jew, right? And what that means is that the Elisha ben Abuya character in As a Driven Leaf is someone who's unable to believe in the religious traditions of his ancestors, but at the same time, he's equally unable to feel at home within the majority Greco-Roman culture of his day. And so he kind of finds himself sort of trapped between one world and another, where he rejects his old life, but he can't fully feel connected to his new life, and he's dealing with the sort of displacement and existential angst of, you know, that in many ways is reflective of, you know, many of the anxieties experienced by secular assimilated Jews in the 20th century. So that's yet another take on the Elisha ben Abuya character, who seems to have just sort of been a perennially interesting figure for thinking about the divisions and boundaries that exist within Judaism and between Judaism and the other cultures that Jews tend to be surrounded with, you know, throughout history. Going to pause here. I've been, you know, talking a lot here about origins and about what we know about Elisha ben Abuya. I've got more stuff that I want to get into, particularly the Rabbi Meir connection, but I want to take a moment here first to just sort of open it up for questions or comments if anyone wants to weigh in before we launch into some more stuff.
I don't know if you can see you.
Yeah, I really love his origin story. I love who he is, because I see this in my son, which you know, and my husband, they were both seekers.
Mm-hmm.
And I can really relate to that.
Yeah. So, Dan, you're a little blurred back there by your filter, but I think you've got a hand up. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, it's not only brain fog, it's body fog also. Um, I I'm sort of imagining the Elisha stories as a way of the rabbis trying to imagine what is it like for the people who don't believe like us.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started to wonder, do we have any sort of like a sociological picture of the entire Jewish community at that time? How many followed the rabbis? How many were doing two things, or you know what you believe in if you don't believe in Torah?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and unfortunately one where there's just, you know, a disappointingly small amount of actual data that we can rely on. The primary picture that we have, like most of the information that we have about the Jewish community during that period, comes from the rabbis themselves. And I think that information can oftentimes be fairly reliable in terms of the rabbi's own experience and how they how they interpreted the situation, but I think probably is missing large chunks of anything that was outside of their personal experience, right? It's not a period of time in which, sociology, in which collection of social data, in which any of that stuff really exists. It's a time in which history is very heavily focused on the story part, right? It's people telling stories of their own personal observations or things that they've heard from other people. And our contemporary ideas about data, about information, about, documentation just kind of didn't exist. There are some other non-rabbinic or extra-rabbinic sources of information on Judaism at the time that we have access to, but they're very sketchy at best. For example, archaeologists have done a certain amount of work, examining gravestone inscriptions from Jewish cemeteries from the period. And that can give you a lot of interesting information that's kind of missing maybe from the rabbinic account of things, right? Some of those inscriptions clearly indicate, for example, that there were a number of extremely important wealthy women who were heavily involved in synagogue leadership at the time, but those women generally don't really get held up as particularly important by the rabbis because they're much less interested in women and women's experiences, right? They've done archaeological digs where they uncovered the architecture of ancient synagogues, and we found mosaics of synagogues from the period, which are very interesting because of the way sometimes those mosaics depict, like astrological themes or other kind of visual kind of motifs that were more common just sort of in the broader Greco-Roman world. So there's a lot of little bits and pieces that we can elucidate that we have that kind of elucidate something about the period. But unfortunately, like the vast majority of the information that we have that comes down to us is coming from the rabbis themselves. And it's very interesting and useful information, but it's probably, limited. Sharon.
What comes through to me from the rabbis is enormous fear. A couple of kinds of fear. Fear of the outside, so that it's a cautionary tale.
Mhm.
Also, a fear of the question that they can't answer, which we still can't answer, when bad things happen to good people. And they must have been confronted with this all the time because, imagine the rate at which children must die in an era like that, as one example.
Sure.
And so the rabbis are confronted with unanswerable questions. And so you kind of make, well, what's the alternative? Oh, the alternative to what we believe is very scary, and you're going to be very lonely, and you won't have our markers or baselines to direct you.
Yeah. In many ways, Elisha ben Abuya is kind of the representation of, a concern the rabbis must have had. And it's kind of the flip side of the rabbinic perspective, right? For the rabbis, it was pretty much self-evident that a life of Torah study was about the best, most pleasurable life that a person could possibly live in this world, that it had many intrinsic rewards. And for many people within the rabbinic community, that almost certainly was the case, right? There's something deeply appealing about the rabbinic way of life. And that fact is most clearly illustrated by the fact that it was persuasive enough to develop this really active community around it that eventually sort of becomes the Jewish community, right? That endures through all sorts of hardship down into the present age. But every inside inevitably has an outside, right? And even if it's self-evident to the rabbis that Torah study and, Jewish piety are worthwhile and valuable ways to lead your life, it was also, at least a thinkable possibility that some people might find their way out of that, right, in some way, shape, or form. And there's a certain amount of anxiety about that. And I think that anxiety, such as it is, that the rabbis had on that score is kind of represented by Elisha ben Abuya. and is kind of I think that fact is maybe most clearly illustrated by the fact that they very infrequently refer to him by his actual name. Most of the time, they don't refer to him as Elisha ben Abuya. What do they refer to him as? They call him Acher. Acher, which means other, right? And that's really, who he was, right? He was one of us, but then he became something else. He left our community to become something else. And the concern about that was very deep and touched on something very visceral for the rabbis. Of course, because we're talking about Acher, right? There's always a story. There's a story that the rabbis tell about how he came to be called Acher in the first place. And it's that when he had his moment of, deconversion, right? Where he gave up Judaism altogether and decided that he just was not, that he was out of it for good. What they say is that he went immediately to a prostitute. And the prostitute took a look at him and she says, well, wait a minute, aren't you Elisha ben Abuya, the noted rabbinic sage? And to prove that it wasn't him, it says he uprooted he plucked a radish and ate it on Shabbat. And when she saw him do that, she said, oh, nope, must have it wrong. It must be Acher, someone else. It must not be him, right? And that's according to that story, that's where he got the name. But yeah, for the rabbis, he's Acher, he's other, right? He was one of us, but he's not one of us anymore. And that was I think kind of scary for them. Joe and then Sharon.
Yeah, actually, Rabbi, I was thinking about, that Elisha ben Abuya straddling those both worlds and not really fitting in to either one of them. But then it started making me think about Josephus. I know Josephus was not a rabbi, but didn't he straddle both worlds? And didn't he give us some insight, perhaps, into what the Jewish world would look like and what outside of the Jewish world would look like? I know he didn't live at exactly the same time as Elisha ben Abuya, but I was just wondering about that, if we can get some information that way from what was going on in the Jewish community through somebody else who straddled both of those worlds.
Yeah, absolutely. Josephus is another one of those sort of figures that is connected in some way, shape, or form with the Jewish world, but at the same time is not really part of the rabbinic community as such. So yeah, he's another figure that sort of straddles that line. In Josephus's case, it's even more tricky in that regard, because he never rejects Judaism, right? Josephus, to the end of his days, sees himself as a Jew, even if some of his fellow Jews regard him as a traitor. Whereas Elisha ben Abuya seems to have identified himself out of the Jewish community. But nevertheless, we're still I think very much that both Josephus and Elisha ben Abuya fall into a similar category of figures who kind of illustrate the rabbinic world from the outside rather than the inside, and they're interesting in that regard. Sharon.
Going back to my theory about the rabbis being afraid, got another reason, which is here is a model of rectitude and what we want our children to grow up in. And suddenly he's gone over to another side, which we don't know about. What a terrible model. What if our children take after him? What if they decide, hey, if he can do it, we can do it? There must have been all that going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. I mean, the rabbis had a reason not to like him, because if everybody decided to reject Judaism, it wouldn't be a religion, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, so they had a reason to be fearful.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly why he was, such a, if not frightening, at least, ominous figure for the rabbis, is precisely that, the rabbis were perfectly aware there were lots of Jews out there who were not rabbis, right? Who were not part of the rabbinic community. And they weren't really threatened by those people because they could regard those folks as being am haaretz, right? As being ignorant of the Torah. they don't know about the Torah yet, but eventually maybe they'll catch on, right? Elisha ben Abuya, though, was something different, right? He had a Jewish education, right? He came from inside the community and he rejected it. And that's maybe something different from someone who never studied Torah at all.
Mhm.
All right, so the one thing that is clear from all of the stories that get told about Elisha ben Abuya is that Rabbi Meir, who was his principal student, he's really the main student, the only student who gets attributed to Elisha ben Abuya in the tradition. He probably taught other people, but they didn't, but they don't get mentioned in the same sentence as Acher. Rabbi Meir, though, does get mentioned with Acher, because Rabbi Meir persisted in maintaining a relationship with Elisha ben Abuya even after his apostasy. Concerning this, the tradition says of Rabbi Meir that he found a pomegranate and he ate the inside and he threw away the peel, right? In other words, he took from Elisha ben Abuya the Torah that he had to teach without necessarily approving or condoning the fact that he had rejected Jewish practice, right? And that was the sort of tricky balance that Rabbi Meir maintained with Elisha ben Abuya for all the years of his apostasy before he died. So the thing I brought, usually we bring a text to kind of share. The one that I brought tonight is actually an extended passage, or several parts of an extended passage, from the Talmud Yerushalmi. I think the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, often has some really interesting stuff to say about Elisha ben Abuya that's maybe even more interesting than what you find in the Babylonian Talmud. And that probably makes sense because it comes from Eretz Yisrael, right? From that part, that's where it was written. And so maybe because that's where Elisha ben Abuya lived, maybe the stories were more, close to home or something like that. But in any event, this is a passage from Yerushalmi, from Masechet Chagiga 9b. And I'm going to share the screen here and let's take a look at this. This is an extended story, and this deals with the complex relationship between Elisha ben Abuya and Rabbi Meir. All right. So I've got this divided into three kind of chunks. If someone could volunteer maybe to read the first chunk that starts with Rabbi Meir sitting.
Sure, I'll read.
Go for it.
Rabbi Meir was sitting and teaching in the house of study of Tiberius. Elisha, his rabbi, passed by, riding on his horse on the Sabbath day. They came and said to him, "Behold, your rabbi is outside." He stopped teaching and went out to him. Elisha said to him, "What were you teaching today?" Meir said to him, "And the Lord blessed the latter years of Job's life more from the former." Job 42:12. He said to him, "What did you say about it?" Meir replied, "And the Lord gave Job twice what he had had before, that he doubled all his wealth." Elisha said to him, "Alas, for what is lost and will not be found again. Akiva, your rabbi, wouldn't have interpreted it thus. Rather, and the Lord blessed the latter years of Job's life more from the former, by the merit of the mitzvot and good deeds that he had done in the beginning."
All right. So there's a number of things that are happening in this story. And so I want to kind of take a second here and see if we can kind of piece together what's going on. What are some things that you notice about this story, this part of the story here, where with regard to the relationship between Rabbi Meir and Elisha ben Abuya? What's actually happening here? Dan, I think I see a hand up.
Yeah. I was surprised that the students encouraged the interchange between Meir and Elisha. They didn't chase him away. They came and encouraged Meir to go see him.
Mhm.
That surprises me. I thought they would consider him, the devil.
See, this is a really interesting point, Dan. I'm gonna open this one up. Does everyone else see the reaction of the students as something that's encouraging of Rabbi Meir here?
I think it could probably go either way. There's not really enough context here, I think, for me to know necessarily what their opinion was. I mean, they were letting him know that his rabbi was there,
Mm-hmm.
and they're still referring to him as your rabbi, which is interesting in and of itself.
Yeah.
But I'm not certain whether it's like, it's a Shanda, he's outside and he's on a horse, blah, blah. Or if it's, an actual curiosity, or, they were encouraging the discourse. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Hey, I'm gonna try and I'm gonna try that. I want to try this by you guys. I'm gonna read this in a slightly different tone of voice and tell me how this one hits. They came and said to him, "Behold, your rabbi is outside." I think there's a way to read what's going on here, not as any kind of enthusiasm for this relationship between Rabbi Meir and Acher, but actually as, how do I want to put this? As kind of shaming and humiliating Rabbi
Yeah.
Meir regarding his insistence in maintaining a relationship with this man.
Yeah, it's like saying your friend is outside, meaning that it's really your enemy, sort of thing. That
Yeah.
he's regarded as not worthy.
Mhm.
The guy that's outside isn't worthy, and
Yeah.
and by token, Rabbi Meir isn't supposed to be associating with him.
Yeah, and that's not necessarily the case, but it's something that for me at least is there as a possibility in the text, right? And if we kind of take that seriously, it opens up room for viewing there to be for imagining a certain amount of tension going on in this story, right? Elisha ben Abuya, right, is outside. He's not only outside the building, he is outside the entire value system of these people who are gathered here on Shabbat to study. And we can tell that from the fact that he's riding by on Shabbat on a horse, right? And yet Rabbi Meir persists in maintaining this relationship and referring to Elisha ben Abuya as his rabbi, even though he is so completely outside of the frame of reference of these of the community to which he belongs.
And yet, what I find really interesting is that all the same, either it's that he's just entirely unself-conscious or what, or just full of chutzpah, I don't know, but nonetheless, Elisha ben Abuya is actually engaging in this, debate about how to interpret this passage, and finds his own response to be, more insightful, and is kind of admonishing his student for, like, I wouldn't have interpreted it that way, so it's like he hasn't even lost his edge, you know?
Yeah, Rabbi Meir here is doing something really interesting. He is engaging his former master in communicating with him in such a way as to try and draw him in, right? He's giving him a bit of Torah, right? And he's giving his teacher a chance to kind of weigh in and to provide a drash on this Torah that he's been teaching to his students. It's interesting in that regard, right? That the story, the piece of Torah that he brings, that he says he's teaching about, is specifically one about regaining something that's been lost, right? The passage from Job here is about how Job lost everything and was completely ruined, but then later God rewarded him twice what he had before, right? And his version of this, right, is to focus on the regaining, right? Meanwhile, Elisha ben Abuya's interpretation focuses instead on the idea that the only reason that Job was rewarded was because he had already been a good man in the beginning, right? We see developing here two different perspectives, right? Two different perspectives on loss and return. All right, let's take a look at the next chat. Next
Can,
little passage.
can I just ask something?
Yeah, sure.
He is also invoking Rabbi Akiva to
Yeah.
make his point, which I thought was interesting.
Absolutely, yeah. This is what's clear is from the context here then is that this is happening after the Bar Kokhba revolt, right? After Akiva has been executed by the Romans, right? And part of the past that Elisha is evoking is not only his past as a rabbi, but also the Torah that has been lost to Israel, right? By the depredations of the Romans, right? Akiva wouldn't have taught it that way. And I know because I was part of that community. I was part of Akiva's generation, and Meir wasn't. He wasn't there. Yeah. All right. Skipping a little bit ahead, we've got another give and take between Elisha and Meir. Somebody else want to volunteer to read this time? Mickey, you got it.
Okay. Elisha said to him, "And what else did you teach?" Meir replied, "Gold or glass cannot match its value, nor vessels of fine gold be exchanged for it." He said to him, "And what did you say about it?" He said, "Words of Torah are hard to acquire like vessels of gold, and easy to break like vessels of glass. And just like vessels of gold and glass, if they are broken, one can go back and remake them as they were. So a scholar who forgot his learning can go back and learn as before." Elisha replied, "Enough, Meir. We have arrived at the Sabbath boundary." Meir asked him, "How do you know?" Elisha replied, "From the footsteps of my horse, I knew that we had gone 2,000 amot." He said to him, "You still have all this wisdom within you. Will you not turn back?" Elisha said, "I cannot." Meir said, "Why?" Elisha said to him, "Because one time I was passing by the site where the Holy of Holies once stood, riding on my horse on a Yom Kippur that happened to occur on Shabbat, and I heard a divine voice coming out of the Holy of Holies saying, 'Return, wayward children,' except for Elisha ben Abuya, who knew my power and yet rebelled against me."
So interesting dynamic here that's developing between these two figures, right? What's going on here?
I think that Elisha ben Abuya is just not going to take anything that Rabbi Meir says seriously, and he's letting him know that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Rabbi Meir is focusing over and over again on the idea that something lost can be regained. In reading between the lines, Teshuvah is real, Teshuvah can happen. Even Elisha ben Abuya can, he says, turn back, right? On the surface, what he means is turn back to remain within the Shabbat boundary, right? What he actually means is turn back and return to the rabbinic community. But Elisha ben Abuya just doesn't seem to, even if he were willing to do that, even if he were willing to turn back, he doesn't seem to think that he could.
And Rabbi Meir was very convincing, showing him that he can turn back. I mean, it looked at, it was a perfect example he was telling him.
Yeah, he's weighing in and using Torah arguments to try and do this. Sharon.
There's a terrible irony at the end.
Yeah.
Because he's turning away from the religion, and yet it is God. He recognizes that God is there, and he's sort of making God an accomplice in this.
Mhm.
That he's not wayward by himself, but that God knows he ought to leave.
Yeah, this version of what's going on of Elisha's beliefs is really interesting, right? He's rejected Judaism, but he seems to still believe in the God of Israel, right? To the extent that for him, it's not even just about his rejection of God. He also feels like he himself has been rejected in turn. It takes two to tango in Elisha's mind. And it's really interesting in that regard. He's very much living in an interstitial place, in a middle place between the world of Judaism and the world of everything that's outside. And he doesn't seem to be able to budge from that place, right? He knows the Torah like the back of his hand, and yet he cannot see his way to rejoining the community and adhering to that Torah that he still feels this connection with.
Yeah. I see something else with this too, that he still has enough love and respect for Rabbi Meir to not let him violate the 2,000 amot boundary, and not cause Rabbi Meir to violate Shabbat. Right? So it's kind of a little bit of a contradiction. We talked just before that to entice the students out, to get them to have a more secular have a more secular life, and here he's stopping Rabbi Meir from that violation. The other thing I find very interesting is that Rabbi Meir is not rejected. Right? That if they say, okay, if we're so afraid and so concerned about Acher, well, so much of Rabbi Meir's teachings are coming from him, right? That why, so there's still got to be some kind of underlying respect for Elisha ben Abuya, that they'll accept his teachings through Rabbi Meir.
Exactly. Yeah. There's, and I think part of what this underscores for the rabbis is this really complex relationship between the sage and the Torah that sage has, right? Even if we reject the sage, right? Even if the individual has done something that is beyond the pale, nevertheless, the Torah that they possess is still recognized by the rabbis as inherently valuable and not something you can just turn your nose up at. And there's something really powerful to me about that idea, that even if the individual is a sinner, nevertheless, we need to have a certain amount of respect for the Torah that they have in their possession. And respect really seems to play an important role in this story, right? This version of the relationship between Elisha and Meir is all about respect, right? The personal respect that exists between Meir, who will still engage his former teacher despite the fact that he's riding a horse on Shabbat, and Elisha, who, even though he himself is rejecting the Torah, is nevertheless going to intervene to make sure that his student, who does believe in these things still, that his student does not inadvertently transgress the boundaries that he has set for himself. It's very much about a personal relationship and the kind of personal respect that can exist between two people who may disagree ultimately about some pretty important things. Dan.
I'm thinking of something that's bothering me, and I guess I'm thinking maybe you can talk me out of it. I feel like Elisha and God have gone through a divorce. And Rabbi Meir is saying, maybe you can get back together again. And Elisha says, no, he won't take me.
Yeah.
And I wonder, why won't God take Elisha? And what's bothering me is the thought that God feels that Elisha knows something that will not let him return. In other words, he's looked behind the curtain.
Yeah, there's an implication here, at least from Elisha's perspective, that like the reason he can't return is because like he knew, like he had a closer relationship with God than most, and yet still rejected God, and therefore like he's, there's no return for him where there might be for someone who maybe there was more mistake in what they did and less, like outward, like specific rejection. I think the thing we got to also maintain here is an awareness that what we're hearing here is Elisha's own account of his situation, right? Elisha's talking about how he feels. He's speaking theologically, but theology is always a reflection of our own personal experience. So maybe there's something to be said for respecting that theology that he's constructing and taking it seriously. But I think there's also something to be said for saying, well, like, okay, maybe Elisha doesn't feel like he is able to return, but that isn't necessarily reflective of God in an objective sense, but rather of Elisha's own subjective experience of God. Joe.
Judy.
No, I was just actually thinking of the story of Pharaoh, the idea of Pharaoh's heart being hardened.
Yeah.
That's what I'm kind of feeling that's happening to Elisha ben Abuya. His heart is hardened. It's not open to, it's not really open to listening to any of those messages from God anymore. I'm not going to compare the intellectual part of it because I don't know the intellectual part of Pharaoh, but to me, it's the heart, the emotion that can't let him go back because that part of him has been hardened. As we say, that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. His mind, though, was still not that it was open to it, he couldn't escape it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. There's definitely some heart hardening going on here, and I think that connection makes sense. Did you have something you wanted to say, Ross?
Yeah, I was actually looking at it kind of differently than the concept of heart hardening.
Ross, can you get closer to the microphone,
You
please?
can also raise
I
our
don't like
volume.
no voice, so I don't know if that'll help. I'm a few days behind Leia in my recovery. But I was thinking about this a little differently in terms of not so much of a heart hardening, but more like that he did not feel worthy any longer. And it was really like his own projection that God said that I can't come back in, kind of thing, when it was really that he couldn't resolve it within himself. And he just knew that, and was rejecting his own self as opposed and just sort of like blaming it on God.
Mm-hmm.
I could be off, but I think it's definitely a possibility.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense too. Yeah. I want to get on and take a look here at this last little bit here. So can I get a third person to read?
Yeah, I'll read, Rabbi.
All right, thanks, Sharon.
Sometime later, Elisha grew ill. They came and said to Rabbi Meir, "Behold, your rabbi has gotten sick." He went to visit him and found him very sick. Meir said, "Will you not repent?" Elisha said, "Those who go back will not be accepted." Meir said to him, "But does it not say you would turn a human being unto dust?" Up to the moment where a soul becomes dust, in that very moment his repentance is received. Elisha wept, and he expired and died. Rabbi Meir rejoiced in his heart and said, "It seems as if my rabbi expired in the midst of repentance." When they buried him, a fire came down from heaven and burned his grave. They came and said to Rabbi Meir, "Behold, the grave of your rabbi is on fire." He went out to visit the grave and found it was on fire. What did he do? He took off his cloak and spread it over the grave and said, "Lie down for the night. Then in the morning, if he will act as a redeemer good, let him redeem. But if he does not want to act as a redeemer, I will do so myself, as the Lord lives. Lie down in this world which is all night, And then in the morning, this is the world to come, which is all morning. If he will act as a redeemer, good. This is the Holy Blessed One, who is good as it is written, the Lord is good to all, and his mercy is upon all his works. But if he does not want to act as a redeemer for you, I will do so myself, as the Lord lives. And the fire went out. Rabbi Meir is a very faithful student. He wants to do everything that he can to ensure the afterlife of his teacher. It's very beautiful.
Yeah. There's something really powerful about Meir's devotion in this story, that he is really willing to go to the wall for Elisha. You know, seemingly also, right, even, you know, if that means to some extent going against God's decree, right? In the end, Meir seems to be saying that if God will redeem you, then well and good. But if not, then I'm going to do it myself. And somehow the power of that seems to have actually been efficacious. That the devotion and the respect that he had for his teacher was enough to go back against perhaps even a divine decree. I think there's something really powerful there about the idea of not giving up on a relationship, you know, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds.
It also seems as if Rabbi Meir is outdoing God, because he recognizes the virtues of Elisha when God does not.
Yeah, I keep thinking that John Meir is carrying such a heavy burden that he has taken upon himself, and it's purely out of love for his teacher.
Yeah. In a sense here, I think that Rabbi Meir is being put into a similar role as we find in the case of, for example, Abraham, you know, arguing God down and trying to save those people of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? He finds himself in that similar kind of God wrestling kind of stance where it's sort of like the role of the human being to hold God to God's word, right? To hold God to God's title of the all-merciful. And that seems to be a really key important characteristic about the way in which Jews, rabbinic Jews in particular, have come to understand the relationship between God and humanity. That to some extent, God is the one who holds us to a moral standard, but we are also the ones who hold God to a moral standard. And I think that that's part of what's on display here in this story with regard to Elisha ben Abuya, that what's at stake is not simply the question about whether God will accept Elisha ben Abuya. What's really at stake is the question about whether human beings are willing to forgive him. And in that regard, right, Meir and his stolid refusal to give up on his teacher seems to be the key linchpin in that whole process. Joe.
Judy.
Rabbi, I'm just wondering, do we need to accept the fact that Elisha ben Abuya actually heard from God, that he heard God say that everybody can be redeemed, but Elisha ben Abuya? That's a story that Elisha ben Abuya is saying happened to him. That might not really have happened, because it could have been just the way that Elisha ben Abuya felt about himself. And I think that what you have been teaching us about Rabbi Meir is that he might have felt the same way, and just accepted Elisha ben Abuya's story, but maybe not believed that that's what that he actually heard those words from God. So I don't really think that Rabbi Meir was going against God. That's how I feel, because we have it's a big acceptance to accept that story, what Elisha ben Abuya heard directly from God, especially in that particular time, because we know in the Torah that there are people who have heard directly from God. But as we move along in the Torah, and then in the prophets, and then in the writing, you really don't have that actual face-to-face or hearing from God that much anymore. It keeps getting less and less. I don't know how much hearing directly from God was accepted in that rabbinic period.
Well, certainly the rabbis have the concept that they have reference to quite often of the idea of the bat kol. Literally, bat kol means daughter of the voice. What it refers to idiomatically in Hebrew is an echo. And what it refers to for the rabbis is it's the kind of divine voice from heaven that the rabbi that can be heard in the rabbi's own time. And every so often there's a bat kol that comes out, and rabbis are reported to have heard a bat kol, and sometimes it's a really key important thing that reveals something really important. The thing is, though, right, we don't necessarily have to accept everything in this story as this one story that everybody says in the story as being authoritative, because there's nothing authoritative about any of these stories, right? As always, about anything, whenever we're talking about the rabbis, there is no single authoritative narrative. There are only many different narratives. Many times those narratives conflict or are contradictory, right? And each narrative depicts its subject from a different perspective. And the rabbinic way of thinking is never to say this narrative is the only true narrative, right? And all of these other narratives are false. The rabbis much preferred to say, here are a million different narratives, and each one presents a different perspective. And the many different voices speaking all at once, somehow that gives us a closer approximation to the truth than if we were just telling one story, right? And certainly that's the case with Elisha ben Abuya. I hope that part of what you might have picked up from what we've been talking about tonight about Elisha ben Abuya is the rabbis tell many different stories about this man. And they're different, right? They contradict. They're not all in agreement, right? That doesn't mean that they're not all valuable, but that they just present a different perspective on this complex and mysterious individual, right? So yeah, I don't think we have to take everything in this one story for granted. I think that taking anything for granted is maybe in some sense missing the point behind these kind of stories, which is they give a particular experience, right? The ending of the story is ambiguous, right? It's ambiguous. It's not entirely clear why the grave is on fire, right? It's not entirely clear that Elisha ben Abuya's understanding of his situation or Rabbi Meir's understanding of his situation are correct, right? All we know is the actions of the individuals, and we can interpret from those actions how they felt, right? And I think that there's something really powerful about an approach to narrative that says there are many different stories that we tell about these people, and some of them contradict, but all of those stories are important because they give us a different perspective. And that perspectival kind of way of looking at things is so characteristic of the way that the rabbis thought and about how Jewish tradition has operated over the past 2,000 years and more.
Right. And my point really is that I'm looking at it that it says more about Elisha ben Abuya than about God. That's how I look at it, because I just can't imagine that that's what God would say to anyone, that everybody can be saved but you. It doesn't make sense to me. That it only makes sense to me, and as accepting that story just reflects Elisha ben Abuya's character.
Sure.
And gives us more insight into his character and why, in my mind, his heart could have been so hardened, how he could not come back to Judaism, how that once he rejected it, there was no way that Elisha ben Abuya felt that there was no way that he could come back. And then the stories about Rabbi Meir, how he dealt with that, show no matter what story is told about Rabbi Meir, it shows Rabbi Meir's character and how much he wants Elisha ben Abuya to come back.
Sure, and that's a very valid point of view. Sharon and then Joe.
I keep trying to find a modern equivalent of this story. And the only thing that comes to me, and it's not an equivalent, is if I look at the traditional ultra-Orthodox community, pretty much anywhere, I can say, yes, it's a beautiful lifestyle. Yes, the people who are very observant of that particular mode of living have quite a beautiful culture. But at the same time, I say, but it's not for me. I can't be that. And I thought of something else, totally unrelated. There's a song from World War II, a jocular, funny song that says, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? And I'm thinking the same thing about Elisha. I found the outside world. Wow. I can't go back, which takes all the religious trappings out of it and is inappropriate, but I couldn't resist.
Yeah. Joe.
All right, so with the fire, with what you said at the end in response to Judy, made me think again of his birth story, that the rabbis were studying and there was a fire.
Right.
And why? Because of the Torah study. And now here, there's a fire on his grave. It's as if his, again, like a respect or an affirmation of his Torah.
Yeah.
Of Elisha ben Abuya's Torah, because of that fire. Also reminded me the story of Yonatan ben Uziel. When he would study, the fire went up and birds that would fly overhead would get burned and fall to the ground. Right? Yeah. But the idea of the fire at the beginning and fire at the end, equating to Torah study.
Absolutely, yeah. And fire is really interesting in that regard in these rabbinic stories because of it's ambiguous, right? Fire can be good and fire can be bad, and sometimes it's both, right? It's really it's whatever it is, it's always seems to be a manifestation of something divine, and that's can be both a positive and a scary experience. Yeah, it's a really it's an interesting figure in this story, the way fire keeps coming up in different ways. Ross.
No, I just wanted to say about what Sharon said. How do you keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? Elisha ben Abuya was, according to what you were teaching us, Rabbi Leah, was not comfortable in that other world. He wasn't comfortable in the world of Judaism, and he was not comfortable in outside of Judaism either. He found no place for himself.
Sure, and that's why he's a very.
I believe you said that.
Yeah, and that's why he's a very.
I don't think it's that story of of after I've seen, how do I go back after I've seen Paris? Because I don't think Elisha ben Abuya thought that the outside world was Paris. That's all that I'm saying.
Russ.
I just wanted to add that I was very moved by the last paragraph that we read, and just really thinking about the quality of the relationship that's being depicted here between Rabbi Meir and Elisha ben Abuya. And if it's any indication of the quality of the teacher, all we have to look at is the quality of the student. And for me, it was just a reminder that, it is not my place to be judging a person's choices, and all the and even more so, just the loyalty there, that's, you know, even if God won't forgive you, I will. I'm paraphrasing here. Um, just really showed me the strength of that friendship and that bond. And that's just very compelling. I thought it was very, very beautiful. And I think we need more of those kinds of bonds among us in our lives.
Yeah, it's a really
Yeah.
powerful story.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to leave it open. Is there anyone who hasn't really had much of a chance to speak, who has anything that they want to share before we wrap it up for tonight? All right, cool. I think let's end it there. Thanks everyone for everything that you contributed tonight. I think Elisha ben Abuya is an inherently interesting figure, both for what he means in the context of the rabbinic world, and also I think for the ways in which his predicament strikes us as being something that's like saying something fairly modern about the situation of the contemporary Jew, which once again is why he was so interesting a figure for Steinberg and his depiction of these stories in As a Driven Leaf, which is definitely a book I recommend for folks to check out if you've never had a chance to read it. It's a great book. And Steinberg, of course, was very heavily associated with the Reconstructionist movement. So there's a connection there. Next time that we meet, which I'm going to have to check some stuff about next Tuesday, but I think probably will be next Tuesday night. Next time that we meet, we'll probably begin looking at Baruria, and then we'll move on and take a look at somebody else. But anyway, thanks everyone for being here tonight, and we will be seeing you again next time.